Hey everybody, welcome back to the Engineered Angler. My name is Franco. I'm a professional engineer, a lure designer, and a lure maker, and an avid fisherman. And today we're going to take a lure that I made several months ago because I wanted to enlarge my favorite lure, the fat belly. And if you've been watching my videos, you know that whenever I go fishing, I rely heavily on that lure. And it usually is the MVP every trip. So when I made this lure, I was just enlarging that fat belly because I thought a big version of that absolutely lethal lure would attract a bigger bite. But in this video, what I'm going to do is modify this big lure to turn it into a swim bait. But not just your typical 2 or 3 part lure. I'm going to make it so that you can take the pieces, chain them together, and make as long a lure as you want. Essentially, an infinite swim bait. Stick around. Now, truth be told, I've already done this with my favorite lure, the fat belly, and created a mold so that I can mold out the 3 pieces. The trick is making the centerpiece a universal piece and shaping it so that if you take the centerpiece out, you have a viable 2-piece swim bait. So you're essentially taking a 1-part twitch bait and making it possible to make a 2-part, a 3-part, a 4-part, or as many parts as you think will actually work for you. So if you wanted to, you could make this thing 10 foot long. So the first step I'm going to do is make 2 castings of this twitch bait lure. And I'm going to use this casting resin. It's called Model Pro. It sets up white and it sets up in about 10 minutes. So I had to run out to the rain to the house for a minute. So if you know the weather in Florida, then you probably can guess what time of day I'm actually doing my videos. So here we have a very typical shad kind of body shape. And the challenging part of doing this is these really round areas where if I cut a section out, they might not match up very well with the 2 ends. I'm going to select an area where we're pretty sure we can shape this center section to meet the 2 ends that are going to meet up with it. Now, they're not going to be perfect right off the bat. Once I get them cut, I can then put it together and see how far off those lines are and then start shaping all 3 pieces. So it's probably going to be something like this, somewhere around here and somewhere around here. So this is going to be more or less what it's going to look like. I'm going to put slots in the leading edges of the back pieces, and then there'll be metal pins that run through the hinge at each section. So let's open up that casting and see what it looks like. All right, that's a good casting. All I got to do is take off all the flash and the vent stuff and this sprue mushroom. I'll do a little bit of sanding and then I'll be ready to cut this. But first, I gotta cast the second one. And I'll get back to you when we're ready to figure out where to put these cuts. So this is a perfect time for the question of the week. One of the subscribers asked me to weigh in on an issue they were having with their original design swim bait. What the bait is doing is it'll swim fine at a slow rate, but as he increases the retrieve rate, the lure wants to roll up or belly up on you. So what this lure builder tried initially is to play with the weight and balance. Because what you're looking for is essentially a really buoyant material you're making out of, whether it's wood or a buoyant resin. And then adding weight near the bottom of the lure. That way the force of buoyancy trying to float it and the force of gravity trying to sink it are opposed to each other, and it tends to want to keep that lure nice straight up and down. That's really important on crankbaits and twitch baits and on swim baits too, but it doesn't have as big an effect on swim baits. And once you have a swim bait more or less balanced, any issue that you have with the swimming on it is probably not going to be fixed with weight and balance. The more likely culprit is symmetry. Being sure that your lure has the exact same cross section on both sides of the center line of that lure. So imagine this cross section was taken vertically right around the center of the lure, and you end up with a shape that looks something like this. I took a little care to draw this symmetrically so that I can show you what it looks like if you're a little off. So right now with a symmetric lure, the flow of water across the body going into the board here is going to create identical turbulence and identical drag and identical lift. And that's where I think the problem is. Imagine that when I carved this, I left this just a little bigger. I'm exaggerating here so that you can see it. So if this is the result of your carving or something similar to this side, since it has more area, is going to create greater lift and a little more drag. So it's likely to want to rotate the body upward so that it would blow out onto its left side. And if you're not sure whether this is what's happening to you, you can actually make small corrections by bending the tie-on eye either left or right. If your lure is blowing out on the left side, tweak the tie-on eye to the right. So basically opposite to the side that it's blowing out on. Now you're not likely going to be able to fix a real bad problem by tweaking it, but you might see it get better. And if you see it improve by tweaking it, you know you have an asymmetry issue. These questions I select from your comments, and I try to select one that is from a subscriber. And if you have questions you'd like to see on the videos, go ahead and put them in the comments after this video. So now we need to work on getting these things cut. And I want to cut it into front and back first. I'm going to cut it where I think will give me enough material to shape my socket, but also will line up with the middle piece. So on the front, I'm going to go just beyond where I carved the gills. And then for the back, I'm going to go right where it starts to turn in really quickly here at the belly. And I'll make sure those cuts are nice and parallel. And then when we have those cut out, we can take a look at this one for the middle piece. And I'll use the jaws of this vise to help me line these lines up. I not only use these surfaces to line up the cut straight up and down, but I can also use them to line up a straight edge so I can get a nice square cut to the line of lure. So I wanted to get those two cuts nice and parallel, and I think I got it. Now I've got to figure out how big of a center section I'm going to want, and that's mostly going to be controlled by the shape of the lure, because in the end they've got to sort of match up here at the two ends. Now that said, you're not going to get the exact same lure as this just in three pieces. There'll be a little bit of a change in shape because I will have to sort of fair these pieces together once we've got them cut out. So the front cut is going to be pretty much where I did the other one, just after the carvings. And then the back cut is going to be as far back as I can get it without getting too far into this steep change in shape, but just a little farther back than where I cut the tail piece. All right, back to the vise to get this thing cut. Now because I want these three pieces to blend, and not only that, I want the center section to be able to be repeated. That means the front of the center has to be the same width as the back of the center. The idea here is to temporarily glue the three pieces together, kind of centered on each other, and then start sanding down the top and bottom so that we have these two edges pretty much equal. And I'm going to glue the pieces together with some hot glue because the surface isn't smooth enough for double stick tape. So I'm just going to put just a small amount on there and just press it together. The tedious part is having to hold it together till it cools. Alright, now the sanding can commence. So the idea here is to even off this line right here across the top. And I gotta do this pretty gingerly because that glue won't hold any real abuse. And then just kind of using the caliper a little bit, I can see how close I'm getting. 11.6 on that end, 11.9 over here. So I can continue to take a little bit off the front and then I'll fair in the back. And that should give me a nice repeatable shape. Now, after a bit of shaping and a good bit of finish sanding, I think we've got a really nice, symmetric, and nicely tapered lure, both in profile and also looking down on it. Before I mold it, I'll put a clear coat on it to make sure I've got a nice glassy finish in that mold. And as I was saying, you do end up with a lure that is different from the original, obviously. Since we've changed the shape, the original location of the tie-on-eye no longer applies. So we've got to figure out where to put this tie-on-eye so this thing will swim. The belly hook eye, I'm going to just incorporate into this hinge pin location and just use the twist eye as the hinge pin. So that'll go there. The tail eye, I'm going to put just below the tail because I want to leave this open just in case I want to put a slot in it and put a tail fin in it. Now the location of the tie-on-eye is really critical because it needs to go in a spot where if you draw a line from the tie-on-eye to the center of the farthest aft part of the lure, that line should divide the lure in equal parts. So let me show you a quick trick on how to work out where that might be. First you want to put a tab of tape, painter's tape in this case, like a little fin on top of the lure. And then take a pin and just poke holes along the top of it, along the area where you think the balance point might be for that lure. And then by trial and error, you hang the lure up on a little pin, trying each hole to see which one will allow this lure to hang pretty much perfectly horizontal. So I marked the one that works for me, and now I'm going to measure from the nose exactly to where that hole is. And for this lure, it's 1 3/4 inches. I'll write that down so I don't forget it. Now I can take this tape off, and using some construction paper, something relatively stiff, I'm going to trace this thing out. And now I'll just cut it out. So there you go.
And now I want to fold it 1 3/4 inches from the nose. Remember, that was our balance point. Make sure you give it a good crease.
Now I'm going to take this really pointy probe, which is basically a pin with a handle, and I'm going to stick that in that fold, and then you can see behind it there's a level, and that top of that level line should be level with the top of the folded paper. So I'll keep shifting it around until it's pretty much level, and then what you'd want to do is just don't take it off.
Without moving it, push the point through the paper.
So it marks the spot and you can't lose it. And now I'm going to take and draw a line that goes from the center of the very end of the lure at the tail and through that hole that we've shoved our pin through. And the point where the line exits at the nose is where we need to put our tie-on-eye. And now I can transfer that spot right onto my blank. And so I don't lose this, I'm going to go ahead and drill the hole right now. So I can unglue them now, and now I'm just going to clean them up and start shaping. But I also enlarged the eye socket a little bit because those little eyes just weren't working for me. And that's about as much as I want to grind in there. So the back of the center section gets a socket as well. Alright, now I'd like to draw a little center line so that I can then sketch in an arc that somewhat matches this arc, but is a little smaller so it fits in there. And I'll get that shape started out on the bandsaw. So the trick is to take your time shaping this. It doesn't have to be perfect. It really doesn't affect the swim action, but it can affect how much of a gap you got to give it to the piece in front of it. I'm going to get it started this way, and then I'll finish it with a little section of tube that has some sandpaper glued on the inside of it. And that's how it gets started. And that's what it's going to look like when it's fitted together. Alright, that's coming out pretty nice. I'll touch it up with some finer grit and then we'll get on to cutting the slot for the hinge. At this point we got to cut in the hinge slots, and I drew out this lure thinking that it was going to retain a lot of its depth from top to bottom, which would mean having to have 2 slots. But right now it's sort of borderline. Let me show you. Typically for 2 slots I want the body to be about 1.25 inches or more. This one is about 1 1/8 inches. It's right on the borderline. I could put 2 slots in it, but there's an issue with that. If I put 2 slots, the head narrows down so quickly that it would become really difficult to have 2 hinge loops coming out of that head. And I can't do any kind of differential like I did on this one. You can see on the white part of the lure I have 2 slots, and as it narrows down towards the tail there's 1 slot. And here's just like a typical small one. It's about 1 1/16 inches wide and it's got 1 slot. So I'm gonna go with 1 slot on all pieces, even though this is sort of on the borderline of wanting to have 2. All right, I wanna put the slot right in the middle. So I'm gonna measure this and it's 1.16. So 0.58 would be the center. And I'll mark that. And I'll measure and mark the tailpiece exactly the same way. And I like cutting the slots with a Dremel disc cutter, but I just put 2 discs on, and that'll give me the thickness of the slot. So at this point I should probably explain that what I'm building isn't actually a functional lure. This is actually just going to be my master. It's going to be my blank. This is what I'm going to make my mold out of. These little eyes aren't really embedded very far in there. And that doesn't matter because that's not how I'm going to build the final one. The final one will be embedded in resin and have a little T on the inside so it can't pull out. Alright, this is coming along really nicely. All I need to do now is put a nice clear coat on it and start setting it in a clay base so I can make a mold of it. But this video is running a little bit long and we're going to have to end it here. We'll be back with part 2 where I make a mold, we paint it, and we take it fishing. Thanks everybody for watching, and if you enjoy this stuff, let me know in the comments and give me a thumbs up. And if you haven't subscribed and you've made it this far in the video, you should probably subscribe. Alright, I'll see you all next Friday. So when I made this lure, I was dropping it on the floor. I'm going to stick that probe where the sun don't shine. And if you haven't subscribed and you've made it this, and if you haven't subscribed and you've,